The arena of chains. The arena shook with the sound of drums. Heavy, deep, each beat echoed like thunder across the stone walls. Thousands of voices rose together, shouting, laughing, demanding blood. Above, the night sky was sealed with iron gates, holding the crowd inside like a giant cage. The smell of sweat, dust, and old blood filled the air, burning in every breath dot in the center of the arena. The sand was already stained dark from past battles. This was not a place of honor. This was a place where lives ended and the crowd came only for the show. From a steel gate on the far side, the gladiator entered. He was a mountain of muscle, an alien beast covered in black armor. His tusks curved outward, his eyes burned yellow, and his heavy blade dragged sparks across the dome. Stone. The crowd cheered louder at his arrival, chanting his name in a rhythm that shook the air. The gladiator raised his blade high, roaring, and the crowd roared back. He was the champion, undefeated, cruel, and merciless. He killed not only to win, but to entertain. Then another gate opened. The crowd grew quieter, waiting. From the shadows, a human stepped forward. He was not large, not armored, not glowing with power. He wore only a torn combat suit, chains still on his wrists, his face marked with bruises from days of captivity. He had no great weapon, only a short iron spear, rough and chipped dot. The crowd laughed. Some shouted insults, others spat. To them, the human was nothing, just another victim, to be crushed under the gladiator's blade. The gladiator sneered. He banged his weapon against his shield, mocking the human. But the man did not answer. He stood in silence, his eyes calm. His breathing steady. Then, from a side door in the arena, a second figure was forced out. An old woman. Her back was bent, her hair silver, her hands shaking as she tried to walk on the rough sand. The crowd howled with laughter at the sight of her. Some threw scraps of food, others shouted cruel words. The announcer's voice thundered over the arena. Tonight, the champion will not face one, but two. A worthless human and his little grandmother. Let the crowd watch them both fall. Old woman stumbled, nearly falling. The gladiator laughed, lifting his blade. But before he could take a step, the human moved. He crossed the sand quickly, catching the old woman before she hit the ground. Gently, he steadied her, whispering words the crowd could not hear. She looked up at him with frightened eyes, but his face did not waver. He placed her behind him, his body forming a shield. The crowd went silent for a moment. They had not expected this. They thought he would run or beg or collapse in fear. Instead, he stood in front of her, his small spear lifted, his eyes locked on the towering gladiator. The gladiator's grin faded. His laugh turned into a growl. To him, this was no longer entertainment. It was an insult. A weak man dared to stand in his way, to protect someone so fragile. He would crush him slowly, painfully, to show the crowd the price of defiance. The drums began again. Boom, boom. The fight had begun. The gladiator moved first, swinging his massive blade with the strength of 10 men. The human raised his spear, bracing himself. The steel rang out like a bell as the weapons clashed. The human was thrown back, his feet dragging through the sand, but he did not fall. He stood again, tightening his grip. The old woman gasped, clutching her chest. She tried to call out, but her voice was lost in the roar of the crowd. The gladiator came again, faster this time, his blade cutting through the air like lightning. The human dodged, the blade slamming into the ground, sending sand flying. 4. A brief moment. The man saw an opening, but instead of striking, he moved back to block the old woman, shielding her from the spray of sand and stone. The crowd shouted, confused. Why was he protecting her? Why was he not fighting only for himself? The gladiator laughed again, though there was anger in his eyes now. "You protect the weak?" He roared, his voice booming across the arena. "Then you will die with her." The human said nothing. His silence was heavier than any answer. He stood tall, his body trembling but unbroken, his eyes steady. He lifted his spear again. The drums pounded faster, the crowd screamed louder, and the gladiator raised his weapon for another devastating strike. The battle had only begun, but already the crowd could feel that something was different tonight. Something they had not seen before. For the first time, a human stood not as prey, but as a shield. And that small act, simple and silent, made the arena feel colder than ever before. The gladiator's wrath, the gladiator charged forward, his heavy blade raised high, a beast ready to crush anything in his path. The crowd roared, their voices echoing across the walls. The ground shook under his steps, and even the old woman felt the tremors through the sand. She clutched her chest, fear in her eyes, whispering prayers no one could hear. The human tightened his grip on the spear. His arms already ached from the last strike, but he did not step aside. He planted his feet firmly into the sand, body straight, protecting the trembling woman behind him. The gladiator swung. The sound split the air like thunder. The human blocked with his small spear, sparks flying as steel clashed against steel. The force sent him stumbling back several steps. His arms burned with pain, his ribs ached from the impact, but he still stood. The crowd erupted with laughter. To them, it was only a matter of time. They thought the human was only delaying the inevitable. The gladiator snarled, baring his tusks. His eyes burned yellow, filled with fury that this weakling dared to resist. He swung again, faster, harder. Each strike shook the ground, each swing sending vibrations through the walls. The human ducked, dodged, blocked where he could, but the sheer weight of the blows left marks on his body. Blood trickled down his arm. His lips split from the shock of a strike that grazed his face. Still, he did not fall. He did not yield. Behind him, the old woman cried out as sand and broken stone flew past her. But every time, the human stood in her way, shielding her from harm. He never looked back at her. His focus was locked entirely on the gladiator. The gladiator's frustration grew. His roars became louder, his swings more wild. He wanted to see fear in the human's eyes, but all he saw was silence, unshaken, determined silence. That silence enraged him more than any insult. He tried to break it. With one sudden move, the gladiator shifted direction and swung not at the human, but at the old woman. The crowd gasped. Some cheered at the cruelty. Others leaned forward in shock. The gladiator's blade cut through the air like fire, but before it could reach her, the human leapt. His body slammed into the gladiator's arm, his small spear rising to deflect the strike. The steel screeched as it twisted, and the blade missed the woman by inches. The crowd's laughter faded into murmurs. This was no longer the usual slaughter. This was something different. The gladiator snarled, his tusks dripping with spit. He shoved the human back with brute force, sending him sprawling into the sand. The man's chest heaved, blood smearing his lips, his body trembling. For a moment, it looked as if he would not rise. But slowly, painfully, he pushed himself up. His knees shook, his vision blurred, but he planted the spear into the sand and forced himself to stand. The old woman's voice cracked as she whispered, "Why? Why do you keep standing?" The man did not answer her. His silence was his answer. The gladiator roared, his voice shaking the air. "You are nothing, a worm, a shadow of strength. I will break you, and when you fall, I will crush her too." The human spat blood into the sand, lifted his spear, and stared straight into the gladiator's burning eyes. The look in his face was not rage, not hatred, but something harder. Something unbreakable. The gladiator struck again, furious now. Blow after blow hammered against the human's defenses. The spear splintered, his arms screamed with pain, his body bent under the weight of each strike. But every time he rose. Every time he blocked, he dodged, he stood. His body weakened, but his will grew stronger. The crowd had fallen silent. The cheers were gone. The laughter faded. Whispers spread instead. Why does he keep standing? He should be dead by now. Is this the strength of humans? The gladiator's fury turned into desperation. His attacks grew sloppy. His blade missed more often, crashing into the sand, sending dust flying. And every time he missed, the human stepped in, pushing him back an inch. Not much, but enough to show he was no prey. Finally, after one massive swing that cracked the floor beneath them, the gladiator stumbled. For the first time, his breath came heavy, his movements slower. Sweat poured down his tusked face. Human saw it. The old woman's wide eyes caught it too. For the first time, she saw something change. The gladiator was tiring. The human lifted his broken spear once more, his bloodied hands trembling, his lips pressed into a firm line. He stepped forward, not back. The crowd gasped as the weak man dared to advance on the champion. The sand shook beneath their feet, the drums pounded louder, and the silence of the crowd was broken by a single whisper that spread like fire. The human is still standing. The gladiator's wrath was far from over, but the balance had shifted. And for the first time, the arena felt uncertain of who would fall. The human's defiance. The gladiator's chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. Sweat poured down his thick neck, and his tusks gleamed under the torchlight. For the first time, the undefeated champion looked tired. The human saw it. He could feel it in the rhythm of the fight. The swings were slower, the recovery longer. His own body screamed with pain, his arms burned, his side throbbed where the blade had grazed him. Blood dripped from his wounds, but his eyes stayed locked on the giant. The old woman clutched her chest from behind, whispering through trembling lips, "Please, don't. You cannot win." But the human did not turn to her. He did not speak. His silence was heavier than words. The gladiator snarled, his pride stung. With a roar that shook the walls, he raised his massive blade and charged again. The sand flew beneath his heavy steps. He swung downward, aiming to split the human in two. This time, the human did not back away. At the last second, he stepped forward, shifting his body just enough. The blade smashed into the ground, splitting stone and sending sparks high into the air. The impact rattled the arena, but the human was already moving. His broken spear shot forward, striking into the gladiator's exposed arm. The tip dug deep, cutting through flesh. The gladiator roared in pain, stumbling back. Blood, thick and dark, splattered across the sand. The crowd gasped. Thousands of voices cried out together in shock. A human small, wounded, chained had drawn blood from the champion. For the first time in the arena's history, the gladiator bled. The old woman's eyes widened. Her fear was mixed now with awe. She had seen what no one thought possible. The gladiator clutched his wounded arm, his yellow eyes blazing with fury. "You dare!" he roared, his voice shaking the walls. "You dare wound me?" The human said nothing. His lips pressed into a tight line. His chest rose and fell, heavy but steady. His silence was defiance. The crowd, once laughing, now sat in eerie stillness. Whispers broke out across the seats. He hurt him. He bled. A human did this? The gladiator's anger boiled over. He swung wildly, his blade cutting through the air, smashing into the sand, sending chunks of stone flying. Each strike was meant to kill, But each strike left him more off balance, more drained. The human moved with patience. He dodged, ducked, waited. Every missed blow gave him another chance. Every roar of anger from the giant gave him another opening. Finally, another strike came down too hard. The gladiator's blade stuck in the ground for a second too long. The human stepped in, slamming his spear into the gladiator's leg. Blood sprayed. The giant howled, staggering back, his weight faltering. The crowd exploded not with laughter, but with chaos. Some shouted in disbelief. Others cheered wildly. The whispers grew louder, and the chant of the gladiator's name faded into broken voices. The human pressed forward. His arms trembled, his body weak, but his spirit burned brighter than ever. Step by step he advanced, forcing the champion to retreat for the first time in his life. The old woman, still trembling, whispered, "He is protecting me. Even against this monster, he fights." The gladiator's pride shattered. His fury grew so strong, he nearly foamed at the mouth. "I will break you. I will crush you." He bellowed. His blade rose high once more. The human raised his spear, though it was cracked and bent. He stood his ground, his eyes burning with the same fire as when he first entered the arena. Their weapons clashed again, sparks blinding the air, sand exploding beneath their feet. The human's body bent under the pressure, but he pushed back, his voice silent, but his will screaming through every muscle. And then the impossible happened again. With a sharp twist, the human forced the gladiator's blade aside. His spear shot forward, striking across the giant's face. A deep gash cut over the champion's cheek, blood dripping down his jaw. The arena went dead silent. The champion had been marked. The gladiator staggered back, his eyes wide, his breath ragged. He touched his cheek, staring at the blood on his hand in disbelief. No one had ever wounded him this much. No one had dared stand against him this long. The human stood tall, his broken spear raised again. His body trembled, his face pale, but his eyes were steady, his defiance stronger than steel thought. The old woman's voice was no longer fearful. It was filled with awe. "He will not fall." She whispered, "He cannot fall." The crowd did not know whether to cheer or to fear. They had come for a slaughter, but what they saw was something else. A man who refused to kneel, a human who fought not for himself, but for another. And as the gladiator bellowed in rage, preparing for one final strike, the crowd leaned forward, hearts racing. The question was no longer if the human could fight. The question was, could he win? The turning point, the gladiator's roar shook the arena, louder than the drums, louder than the crowd. His rage echoed off the stone walls, making even the spectators tremble. His armor glistened with sweat and blood, his tusks dripping with spit as he charged forward with renewed fury. The human stood his ground. His body shook with exhaustion, his breath ragged, blood dripping from his wounds, but his eyes stayed sharp. He had no armor, no shield, only a cracked spear and a will that refused to bend. The gladiator swung with the strength of a storm. His blade crashed down, shattering stone, sending a spray of sand into the air. The human dodged by inches, rolling across the ground, his spear scraping sparks as it blocked a second strike. The force was enough to rattle his bones. His arms felt as if they might break, but still he held on. The old woman cried out behind him, covering her head with shaking hands. Dust stung her eyes, and the smell of iron and sweat filled her lungs. But even through her terror, she saw him stand again, always placing himself between her and the monster. The crowd no longer laughed. Their voices had changed. Some still shouted for blood, but others were silent, leaning forward in awe. Whispers spread through the seats. He is still standing? He wounded the champion. Is this what humans are? The gladiator's fury twisted into desperation. His strikes came faster, but with less control. The giant was burning his strength, each swing draining him, each roar shaking his body more than the man before him. The human noticed. His eyes narrowed, watching carefully. Every miss, every stumble, every heavy breath was a sign. The champion was tiring. The gladiator lunged, thrusting his blade forward. The human sidestepped, twisting his body and letting the steel skim past. He slammed the butt of his spear into the gladiator's ribs. The giant staggered with a grunt of pain. The crowd gasped. The gladiator swung wildly, his blade cutting through empty air. Again, the human slipped past, quick and precise, his spear grazing across the giant's thigh. Another wound. Small, but it left the crowd roaring with shock. The old woman's lips parted, tears in her eyes. He's fighting back. The human advanced slowly, step by step, his battered body moving like a shadow. His spear was cracked, his hands bloodied, but his will was iron. He pressed forward, forcing the gladiator to step back for the first time in his reign. The champion roared, furious at the thought of retreat. He swung with both hands, his blade crashing down like a falling mountain. This time, the human met it. Sparks exploded as steel clashed against steel. The impact sent a shockwave through the sand. The crowd gasped as the gladiator's blade wavered, his arms trembling from the resistance. The human pushed back with everything left in him, teeth clenched, muscles screaming. Slowly, impossibly, the gladiator's blade was forced aside. Crowd erupted into chaos. Some shouted in disbelief, others cheered wildly. The chant of the gladiator's name, once thunderous, broke apart into confusion. The human wasted no time. With a swift move, he swung his cracked spear upward, striking. Across the gladiator's jaw. Blood sprayed into the sand. The giant stumbled back, his knees shaking. For the first time in the arena's long history, the champion of countless battles had been driven to his knees. The old woman covered her mouth with trembling hands. Her eyes filled with awe as she whispered, He is turning the battle." The gladiator clutched his bleeding face, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. His yellow eyes burned with hatred, but there was something else there now. Fear. The human stood tall, his cracked spear raised again. His body trembled with exhaustion, but his eyes remained steady. He had no words for the crowd, no boast for his enemy. His silence spoke louder than any roar. The arena was alive with chaos. Some cried for the human to be killed. Others shouted for him to finish the fight. The counselors in the high seats leaned forward, their faces pale, uncertain. Gladiator roared again, rising back to his feet. His pride refused to die. He lifted his massive blade, his hands shaking, his fury unbroken, but the crowd could see it. The tide had turned. The human had taken the impossible and made it real. He was no longer prey. He was no longer just a man. He was something else, something unyielding. The old woman, tears streaking her face, whispered with trembling awe, "He cannot be broken." And as the gladiator charged again, desperate for one last chance to destroy him, the crowd knew the truth. The end was coming. The moment of victory. The drums beat faster now, their sound like a pounding heart. The crowd's voices clashed in chaos, some screaming for the gladiator to finish the fight, others chanting for the human, voices breaking with disbelief. The gladiator roared and charged again. His blade swung with the weight of desperation, cutting through the air like a storm. Dust and sparks flew with every strike. The human blocked, ducked, and moved, his body trembling, his wounds burning, his breath ragged. Each clash of steel sent pain through his bones, but he refused to fall. His cracked spear shook in his hands, ready to snap at any moment, but still he fought. The gladiator lifted his blade high, his roar echoing like thunder. He slammed it down, the force splitting. The sand. The human twisted aside, rolling across the arena floor. The blade smashed where he had stood, leaving a crater of stone. The crowd gasped. Some held their breath, eyes wide. The old woman screamed, thinking it was the end. But from the dust, the human rose again. His spear raised, his body weak, but unbroken. The gladiator's fury grew. Stay down. He roared, spittle flying from his tusks. Why won't you stay down? The human's silence was sharper than any insult. He stepped forward again, slow, steady, defiant. His eyes locked on the giant like a predator, not prey. The gladiator swung again, but his arms were slower now, his breath heavy. The human ducked under the blade and thrust his spear forward, striking deep into the gladiator's side. The giant roared in agony, stumbling back. Blood poured onto the sand, black and thick, staining the ground. The arena erupted into chaos. Some shouted in rage, others in awe. The whispers became shouts. The human is winning. The gladiator's knees buckled, but his pride screamed louder than his pain. With a furious roar, he swung wildly, his blade cutting the air, desperate to strike. But the human was faster now. He slipped past the giant's clumsy swings, his movements sharp and precise. His spear cut across the gladiator's leg, then his arm, each wound weakening him further. The once mighty champion staggered, his body trembling, his breath ragged. The crowd had never seen such a sight. Their champion, the monster who had crushed hundreds, was being driven back by a single human. The old woman clutched her chest, her tears streaming. Her lips whispered, He is doing it." The gladiator roared one final time. With every ounce of strength left, he raised his massive blade high and brought it down in a killing strike. But the human was ready. With a sharp twist, he sidestepped, his cracked spear rising. The giant's own weight carried him forward, his blade crashing into the ground. The impact shook the arena, dust and sparks flying. And in that heartbeat of weakness, the human struck. His spear drove upward, piercing through the gladiator's chest. The crowd screamed, some in horror, some in shock, some in wild cheers. The gladiator staggered, his tusks dripping with blood, his eyes wide in disbelief. His massive body swayed, his hands clawing at the spear lodged in his chest. Human stood firm, his hands locked on the weapon, refusing to let go. His face was pale, his body trembling, but his eyes burned with fire. The gladiator let out one final roar, a sound that shook the heavens before his knees gave way. His massive form crashed into the sand, the arena trembling under his weight. Silence. Fell. The champion was dead. The human stood over him, bloodied, broken, but alive. His chest heaved, his body covered in wounds, but he remained standing. He turned, looking at the old woman, and spoke his first words since the fight began. "You're safe now." The old woman wept, her hands covering her face. She had been saved not by strength, not by armor, but by the will of a man who refused to bend. The crowd erupted in chaos. Some shouted for his death, unwilling to accept their champion's defeat. Others cheered wildly, raising their voices to the night. The arena shook with the storm of sound. And then, from the high seats, 12 figures rose. The wives of the gladiator, clad in royal garments, their faces unreadable. They stepped down into the arena. The crowd gasped, confused. The human, still, holding his broken spear, turned slowly toward them. One by one, the 12 wives knelt before him. The arena fell silent again. The old woman's eyes widened. The crowd's voices died in their throats. Even the counselors in the high seats leaned forward in shock. The wives lowered their heads, their voices soft but clear. "Master." The wives' decision in the arena was silent. Thousands of eyes stared, frozen in disbelief. The gladiator's giant body still lay in the sand, lifeless, his blood soaking into the ground. And before him stood the human, broken spear in hand, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. Then the silence broke, not with laughter, not with jeers, but with gasps that the 12 wives of the gladiator, dressed in their flowing robes, had stepped into the arena. Their movements were graceful, deliberate. The crowd whispered in confusion, unsure what they were about to do. The human turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as the women approached. His grip on the broken spear tightened. He did not know if this was another trick, another test. The old woman clutched her chest, her lips trembling. "No," she whispered. "This cannot be real." But it was real. The 12 wives walked across the sand and stopped in front of the human. For a moment, the world seemed to stop breathing. Then, one by one, they knelt before him. The crowd gasped again, voices rising in disbelief. "What are they doing?" someone shouted. "They bow to a human?" The wives lowered their heads. Their voices were soft, but they carried across the arena like a blade cutting through silence. "Master." The word echoed, shaking the air. More than the gladiator's roar ever had. The human froze, his bloodied hands trembling. His eyes flickered with confusion, but he remained silent, steady, watching. The eldest of the wives lifted her head. Her eyes met his. "Strength is not measured in cruelty," she said, her voice calm but sharp. "Strength is not in power, but in protection. You stood, not for glory, but to shield the weak. That is true strength." The crowd roared in chaos. Some shouted in anger, others in awe. The arena split like a storm, voices clashing as the galaxy itself struggled to make sense of what it had witnessed. The old woman's eyes filled with tears. She whispered, "He saved me." And now even they see it. Another wife spoke, her voice trembling with respect. "We were bound to him," she sighed, glancing at the dead gladiator. "Bound by fear, bound by chains of pride. But you," she turned back to the human, "you are no chain. You are choice." The counselors in the high seats stirred, their robes shining in the torchlight. Their faces were tight, uncertain. One counselor rose, his voice thundering. "This is madness. You cannot choose a prisoner. You cannot kneel to a human." But the wives did not rise. Together, their voices joined. "We kneel to the one who cannot be broken." The crowd erupted again. Some screamed for the human's death, calling him a threat. Others cheered wildly, voices uniting behind him. The arena shook with the storm of sound, fear, and awe. Clashing like fire and ice dot, the human said nothing. His silence was his shield, his steady gaze his only weapon. He looked down at the wives, his face unreadable, his blood dripping slowly onto the sand. The old woman whispered to herself, "He does not ask for this. He does not seek it. And yet, it comes to him." The council leader rose now, his golden robe glowing. His voice carried authority across the chaos. "By law," he said, "the arena's will is final. The champion has fallen. The wives have chosen. The human lives." The crowd gasped again. Some cried out in outrage, others in wild cheers. The law could not be denied. What had happened in the arena would stand forever. The 12 wives rose to their feet, but their eyes stayed fixed on the human. One by one, they spoke again, their voices carrying through the storm. "Master." The human lowered his broken spear, his chest heaving. He looked at them, his eyes dark and steady. Still, he said nothing. His silence was his answer. The old woman wept openly now, her tears streaking her face. She whispered, "The galaxy has seen it. A man who fights for nothing but to protect." "And now?" They call him Master. The arena's torches flickered. The chants of the crowd clashed like thunder. The wives stood by his side. And for the first time, the galaxy saw the impossible made real. A human had defeated the champion. A human had protected the weak. And now, 12 wives of the fallen knelt at his feet, giving him a title he had never asked for. Master. The rise of the master of the arena had never been so loud, yet never so divided. Half the crowd screamed for the human to be executed, their voices filled with rage. The other half cheered with wild energy, chanting his name, their voices shaking the very gates. Above it all, the drums stopped. The silence between the beats was heavier than stone. The human stood in the middle of the chaos, his body bloodied and broken, his cracked spear hanging loosely in his hand. Behind him, the old woman trembled, her face streaked with tears. And beside him, 12 wives stood proud, their eyes fixed on him, their voices steady as they repeated one word that shattered the night. Master. The counselors in the high seats leaned forward, their golden robes shimmering under the torchlight. Their eyes were cold, their whispers sharp. They had seen many fights in this arena, but never one like this. Never a human standing victorious, never 12 women kneeling at his side. The council leader finally raised his hand, and silence swept over the crowd. His voice carried across the arena like a blade. The champion is dead. By law, his title falls. His wives have chosen. And this man, though human, lives. The arena has spoken. The words cut through the chaos like thunder. The law was absolute. No one could deny it. The crowd exploded again, some in anger, others in awe. Aliens shouted in disbelief, voices clashing, fists shaking, some throwing objects into the sand. But the wives did not move. Their decision was final. The human looked around slowly. His chest rose and fell with deep breaths. He saw the fury in some eyes, the respect in others. But his own face remained calm, unreadable. He did not raise his weapon in triumph. He did not shout victory. He simply stood, silent as stone. His strength shone not in words, but in presence. The old woman whispered from behind, her voice trembling. With awe, you never sought power, and yet it follows you. You only wished to protect, and now they call you master. The wives stepped closer, forming a circle around him. Their movements were protective, not submissive. One spoke softly, her voice clear. We choose you not because you conquered. We choose you because you stood when all others would fall. You are our shield, our master. The words sent a ripple of shock through the arena. The old chants of the gladiator's name were gone. In their place, new whispers spread. The human. He cannot be broken. Is this the strength of earth? The council leader's voice rang out again. This day will be remembered. The arena has witnessed something it cannot deny. Humanity will not be mocked. Humanity will not be silenced. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some glared at the human with hate. Others looked at him with something worse fear. The human lowered his broken spear, finally letting it drop to the sand. His body sagged with exhaustion, but he did not fall. His silence was a roar louder than the crowd itself. The old woman reached for him, her frail hand trembling. He turned, steadying her, his expression soft for only a moment. To her he whispered, "You're safe. That's all that matters." The 12 wives lowered their heads again, their voices uniting in one final word. Master. The arena trembled under the sound. The title, worn in blood, had become legend in a single night. And beyond the arena, across the galaxy, word spread faster than fire. Stories of the human who stood against the champion, the man who shielded the weak, the fighter who turned enemies into followers. The whispers grew in markets and barracks, in council chambers. They call him master. One man, 12 wives. A legend is born. If a human can do this, what else are they capable of? Fear crept into the hearts of alien leaders. Respect grew in the voices of those once mocking. And in the shadows of the galaxy, the first sparks of something greater began to burn. The human himself did not boast. He did not raise his voice or claim a throne. He stood silent, carrying only the weight of what he had done. Yet his silence was louder than any victory cry. The old woman smiled faintly through her tears. She had lived long enough to see kindness turn into power, protection turn into legend. She whispered softly, "The galaxy will never forget this night." And she was right. The drums would never sound the same again. The arena would never be the same again. And the galaxy would never look at humans as weak again. For on that night, a man stood not as prey, not as victim, but as protector. And because of that, 12 wives bowed, a crowd fell silent, and the stars themselves seemed to burn brighter. The rise of the master had begun.